Hello, everybody. We're just making sure the technology is working. Welcome to our third, can you believe it? This is our third Finding Fitzgerald live event. And hopefully, I changed the time around a little bit, and hopefully, more people can come. If not, we'll definitely keep it posted, and you can ask questions later, and we'll move along from there. I'm going to take a little bit of a break before I get started on what today's topic is to thank every one of you who've asked about my daughter who had COVID-19 and is living in Scotland on her own. She is greatly improved. She's been cleared of the COVID. It takes 3 weeks to a month for the actual sort of return of your physical energies, but she's much better. We're much happier. We're sleeping a little better. It was quite an experience, and I've decided that COVID-19 is something I would not wish upon an enemy. It is really, really painful, and we are just so grateful for the support and the understanding, and glad that our story turned out as well as it did. So today, in case you read or haven't read, what we're going to do is buy about 4 weeks worth of time and encourage everybody in our group to read John's first two books, or maybe three, Papa Married a Mormon, Mama's Boarding House, and Uncle Will and the Fitzgerald Curse. Now, Uncle Will is hard to get hold of. It's very expensive. It's incredibly rare. So if you never get to that one, I completely understand. I know that we've got a few people who have books now on order. And oh, thanks, Katie. Thanks for Chris. Sorry, looked quick and you said Chris. Thank you, Chris. We are glad she is getting better too. It's not easy to watch someone you like on live stream sit and try to breathe. It's very painful. Back to the plan. So by about middle of May, maybe end of May, we're going to have book discussions on those two books. Since they're not common to our group, we came in as great brain readers, but as we've continued to grow, people have wanted to go back and read the rest of them. And I do have up on the Facebook page links to two bookstores that sell the books, and you are supporting local businesses, which would be great if you could order them through them, because that keeps them going. But it also, they are shuttered down, which means things are taking slower to get responded to. But they both hosted me, so I really would be thrilled if you do that. But you can also get them at eBay, and or reach out to me if you have other questions. So today I thought we would start with present day price. Next week we'll move to the price that John would have known and John's family would have known, and kind of tie us back to the stories that way. And why I picked present day price partly is because that's where we were going to go this summer. We were all going to meet there. We were going to walk. We were going to see these buildings. We were going to put this story into some kind of context and more old and new. So I'll start with new, leave you with a teaser for old, and then we'll move on from there to discussing various characters, real life and otherwise, that made the stories what they are. And between that, we're going to do the finders and seekers, people who before me had gone hunting for Fitzgerald. And you're going to get a few snapshots of one group today just because we're using their photos in our photo group. So we're going to jump right in and explain that Price is a very typical Utah town. Utah maps its towns north, south, east, and west. And this is really key because for historians, when they went back looking for John's work and passed over Price, part of the reason they passed over it is that the descriptions in the book don't match an east, west, north, south dynamic. It was cut off by the trains, the right side of the tracks or the not so right side of the tracks. And so the town that they defaulted to were two towns in southern Utah, which were a great place to go because that's where he set them. of leads and silver reef, and that he used that. And he very well might have used their stories because they were similar back-to-back towns, like Aidenville and Silverlode are in his books. However, he didn't have to reach that far, and that's what we'll find out in the next 2 weeks, that it really wasn't as big of a jump as historians looked at it. So if you saw a map of Price today or drove into Price, you would see very much, and I don't know how well this is going to turn out. We're going to try this. There we go, cameraing here. So it's a north, south, east, west. And it does have a train running through it, but it kind of follows the east-west line. And a walking tour that we were going to take, but we will have to do it in 2 years, also lays out the same way with the different buildings and so forth. When I first drove into Price, I of course had Aidenville on my brain, Aidenville on expectation. And as I pulled in, it really took me a few minutes to get my bearings and understand where things were from the few pieces of documentation that I had. So when you go to it and walk it, you have to put on yesterday, John, and now to kind of come up with your story. So when you enter the town of Price, there's a beautiful sign up front that welcomes you to Price, and I can't find that in a split second here. We'll find it later, I guess. Anyway, it welcomes you to Price. As you drive in, you're going to be looking at Main Street, Price. And you might recognize Main Street Price from the cover of Finding Fitzgerald. It is just one straight line after another. But along Main Street are these really delightful older buildings. Try to get close enough that you can see. They retained buildings from once upon a time. These various buildings have been used for everything from gambling halls to hotels to mercantiles. And so just walking down Main Street, you kind of fall into what it would have been like before there was pavement, before there was cars, before there was parking and those kinds of things. One of the buildings down that Main Street that is a very old building and has been around for ages is now a cafe. But we were actually going to have lunch there. And if you go inside this wonderful building that has been 5 or 6 different kinds of buildings. Yes, Paul, you can ask a question about Tom later on. All the wallpaper is from the town newspaper and from historic sites around the town as it grew up. And so it's a really fun place to get your lunch and sit down. And the tables are glass covered, but underneath them are the clippings. And so you can read. And so there's Papa's establishments there. There's other things. And it's really fun to sit and eat lunch there. And they're open. Yes, Mark, there are pictures from downtown Price, and we will do those next week. So you have to come back and see us because they're really fun too. The other thing in town is that if you go a little farther out of town, out of the obvious, and 2 streets over, you get to what is left of the original town, the one Mark is asking about. And there are only a few buildings left. But This is where you get to sort of touch what John got his ideas from. And the most prominent building that I fell in love with, and it took me a while to put the whole thing together, was a building that has, okay, how do we do this? It's painted on the side, and it still has liquor advertisements on it from bygone days. It's the last remnant. It's the very end of the street. Right next to it is a small cemetery from 18. Okay, sorry. I don't know if I can get that. Can you see that at all? I'm sorry, I'm going to make everybody dizzy while I try to get this in the camera. Okay, 1886. And it's really tiny. This is not where the Fitzgeralds are buried, but it's where early settlers were buried. And so you get to look in at this dusty old place. And the building that I showed you the side of belonged to a man by the name of Lowenstein. And this, we're going to try to get this up close, is the front of Mr. Lowenstein's building. And it's still standing. Mr. Lowenstein was a Jewish peddler and mercantilist. And he came in and was one of the first Jewish immigrants in Price and set up a small store and advanced to a bigger store and eventually advanced to this mercantile that is still standing. And you would know him as A.B. Glassman. Now, he didn't die in real life. He became very prominent, but he left a huge impact on Price. And he was somebody that the town looked to. He hosted dances every time he'd open a new store. He didn't set boundaries on who could shop at his store. There were a few boundaries out there. He didn't have prejudice or bias, and it made a big difference in this town that was binding communities all over the place. And so it's really fun. I did not know it was A.B.'s store until I was doing research and began to piece all these things together that I'm assuming John took his idea from Mr. Lowenstein. Because there's ads, there's clippings where Mama in real life bought something from Lowenstein's in the newspaper, and I realized that that's where the idea of him came from. Moving back up into town, but just off of Main Street, is this kind of the city center. And in the city center was the library that had the only artifacts, if you'd call it, to John. There are no plaques. There are no statues. There is nothing. And if you mention John or the books, people look at you and they're like, nah, I've never heard of him. And even if you kind of tell them about it, they still haven't heard of it either. And the day I went into the library, I was pretty discouraged. I wasn't finding what I wanted, and the librarians at that point knew nothing about them. They were really sweet. And finally, the head librarian said, no, over by the front door. And there's this glass cabinet, and you walk right past, and you completely miss it. And in there was an Eagle Scout project. And it was all about John. It was some collections of John. So that's where that collection comes from, and that librarian. And on our first trip back after I began doing research, they hosted us for an evening of John's history and stories, which was really neat. Right next to the library is the city center, and there's a peace garden in it, and there's also a statue to World War I soldiers. Price was really proud of They're men and women who have served throughout all the years, but World War I, of course, was the very first one for that town where they sent people off, and they did a big bang up job sending them out. And it's important to us because John's real life oldest brother, William, served in World War I and World War II. So his name is on that plaque beneath the statue, and you can go and sit there and just reflect about, where they went and what they did. And later on, as we talked about John last week, he would go and work for United Press and serve as a correspondent, not during the war, but during peacetime between the two wars, and just do work there. And so it's kind of special to go sit there and just try to imagine what William went like, what Papa and Mama felt like when their oldest son went off to war, to this new thing that would be really intense. And he came back alive, and he sent letters to John, and we'll do some visiting with that, but that's kind of a fun thing to see. From that statue, you can start heading north, and as you head north, you're going to cross a street, and on that street, on 100 West and 2nd West, I think it is a house that looks very similar to this house, which is a photo in Papa Married a Mormon of John and his family when he was little. And when I saw the house that looked like this, I don't have the photograph of it, I was so excited. So I took a bunch of pictures and then realized I probably shouldn't be taking pictures of strangers' houses. So I slipped a note in the door of this house that looked just like that house, said I was this writer, and could I wanted to let him know I was just taking pictures for my research, and left him my phone number, and it would change my life. They would invite me to dinner, they would drive me through the town, and I would begin to see it in a different way than I would have seen it any other way. However, as I'm at that dinner, the house that I thought it was is not the house that belonged to the Fitzgeralds. The house that belonged to the Fitzgeralds was across the street. And I have one photo of it today, and this cute group of kids sitting there in front of it was a group of school kids from Northern California who took an entire field trip up to Utah, to see everything related to John Dennis Fitzgerald. They had done a year-long study of his books. They'd written a book of their own, or created a book of their own, where they took stuff they learned about him and history and sort of dropped him into place there. And then they came up on this field trip and did a whole bunch of events, and we will talk more about them in a couple of weeks. But that was the best picture that they had of the house, and the owners were very nice, the Frys, to let them come and take a picture on their front porch and visit with them. From the Fitzgerald home, if you turn east and keep heading on down, you will run into a very important church. And this is the church that the Fitzgeralds would have worshiped in. And it is right there. And it is still in operation. When Price was first settling, they didn't have a Catholic denomination church. They had a traveling father who would come through, do baptisms, births, deaths, whatever needed to be done, and then move along. Over time, he worked hard and managed to get a church built. He got a convent built. The convent eventually became Price Academy. And today it is still a thriving church. And it has hosted 2 or 3 Fitzgerald family member funerals in it. Again, hopefully next year when we go to the Greek festival, we'll get to go inside it. I've been inside. It's very nice. It was the first church I found when the people whose house I'd taken the photos of invited me to dinner. They took me on a drive around town, and that's how I got to see that. But that would be Papa's church and the kids' church. Um, Heading south through town, we would run into the Greek church, and it's really a stunner of a church. The Greek people have been a part of Price since its beginnings, and they are still a very strong part of the community. Our event will be corresponding with their annual Greek festival that they've been doing for years. They serve Greek food, they dance, they do games, they do activities, and the church is open. It's the only time it's open for people to come in and publicly tour it. And the last time I was there, I took the tour, and it's really beautiful. And here is one shot of a staircase and stained glass windows at it. And it has a whole bunch of stained glass behind the altar, and it's really lovely. But the idea of Basil Kokovinus didn't come out of thin air. John obviously knew quite a few Greek kids, probably had some of those experiences and tied them into the singular character. And so you kind of get to touch, again, a little of that inspiration that brought the books to life. After you go to the Greek church, you kind of head back out, still heading now this way east, and you find yourself at the Price Cemetery. And the Price Cemetery is huge. It's not small like the little one that I showed you earlier. It's really big. A lot of green grass and lots of it. And on the very west side, if you step in not too far, you find yourself standing on, without working too hard, the Fitzgerald family member tombstones. So here are John's brothers, Tom, and then Charles and Bill. It's like they shared a bedroom together. Above them is Papa Fitzgerald. Let's see if I can get this so you can see it. Come on in there. And next to him is a rose bush that, if you've read my book, I got stuck on because I was so busy imagining myself playing hide and seek in the cemetery. I didn't stop to note the rose bush until it snagged me. And on the other side of the rose bush is, come on, focus on here. I don't know if you can see it. Come on. That is Mama Fitzgerald's. There we go. And you will note there's a name difference. We will address the name difference in a future podcast. And this is what Papa and Mama's side by side, come on, headstones looks like, if you find it. One of the other fun things to do in the cemetery is to go all the way to the back, because at the back is the section of the cemetery for outlaws and gunslingers. And they have these wonderful, ornate, huge tombstones that tell their story, and who was the last one shot in the town, and who had been riding with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and then became the sheriff in town. And it's just a fun place to just soak yourself in the place that John knew, that his parents knew, that was not unreal or far away or made up on a movie screen, and where he brought them into the story. And so that is the fastest overview with pictures that I can give you of this town of Price, that I'm hoping we will all be able to meet next year, because we have a whole year now to save our pennies, make time, come see it. And they really want us, by the way. Ramada Inn is super excited. The newspaper is going to do 2 or 3 articles about John and his work. We have one of the very first seekers. She's going to meet us there, and she has some memorabilia. So it's going to be a fun week. And that's in July next year. But I thought I would throw up some pictures of that cute group, and we'll talk more about them, as they went to visit the cemetery, because they did a full, okay, let me get this right. They did a full thing where they brought flowers, they laid them on the wreath, they had a tour guide take them to different spots. I mean, this was a big deal. And that is them touching the tombstone of this person they've been studying for a full year. The price of today is not the price of yesterday. And one of the best things that happened for me from that dinner that spontaneously was thrown for me was that one of the members at the table was a lifetime member of Price, or nearly. Like, he'd moved when he was a really little boy, and so he knew why the Fitzgerald house doesn't look like it does in the pictures, and why it got set backwards and how it got moved up. But he also knew how the town was laid out. And on my last day, the very first time I went for a 3-day research excursion. On my very last day, when I went to say goodbye to them and thank them, he gave me a folded up piece of paper. And I didn't look at it till I got to the airport, because I was kind of rushing. But it was a hand-drawn map of Price as it was back when John would have been little. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm going to try to move it out a bit. Once I could see that the town actually ran different than it does today, I could understand where John got his inspiration, how the story felt to him. And I am assuming that when he came back for Mama's funeral in real life, he probably took a walk around the town that had changed so much since he was a little boy, to try to acclimate himself on it. It wasn't the same town that he knew, with the house that his dad had built, with the buildings and the things that belonged to their family. Those things were long gone. So next week, we're going to take you down that road. We're going to show you pictures from there, try to describe the events that led to getting the town up on its feet, why it was such a unique town back in its day and still is today, and set you in the story that John would have known. So that's my overview. I know the pictures are hard. We're still trying to figure out how to do this. I will try to put them on the Facebook page so people can look at them more. I will check for any questions. Paul, you had a question about Tom, so I don't know if you're still here. If you want to ask it, go ahead and see what we've got here. Chris, you said that's not how I thought the Fitzgerald house to look at all. I pictured it. It does sound bigger and better in the book. And when I'm hoping to find the other house, I'm going to write somebody and ask Jean if she's got one for me. It looks much more that way. And so when I first walked into it, Chris, I was sure I was in the right house. I mean, from the get-go. And so it was really shocking to sit in the middle of a meal, all believing that I'm sitting in the house, and people are saying, oh, nobody ever thought it was this house. It's that one across the street. And I thought, really? Wouldn't have guessed it for the life of me. So it is a bit of a shock to look at. But It is a smaller house, but there's a little more to that story, and I won't spoil it because I think you haven't read my book yet. So I will answer that one for you next week because there is a little more to that story. But the house that I did show you in the picture was a Fitzgerald home. Um, and I don't know if Paul is still on. You had a question, and I'd love to answer it if I could. So I don't know if you're still. And so, Mark, we will definitely do pictures from um, from what it was back in the day. Because I've got plenty of those, and they're really fun to look at. So, Paul, did you get my book, Finding Fitzgerald? Paul's question is, Tom died a lonely man. I'd love to hear more about how and why. So before I do spoilers, I'm going to ask, because not everybody's read the book. I answer that in Finding Fitzgerald. That's probably the key piece that I deliver. A lot of the other pieces I wanted to deliver, I didn't have. I mean, I had my documentation, but I needed permissions to share that documentation. But everyone felt like I was okay. Mark. So Paul, if you let me know if you've read the book, and then if you haven't, then I'll answer it. Mark, there was an itinerary that was in process, but it hasn't been set yet, only because we aren't doing it this summer. We're going to do it next summer. The Greek festival postponed it until September, which then made it kind of hard for people who were going to be putting kids back in school to come to our event. So we have just moved our event to next July, and I'll get the dates as the calendar rolls around there. It's usually the second weekend in July. But I can put those itineraries out, and as we get closer and I get things nailed down. Okay, your question came through. So yes, your question came through, Paul. Thank you. So I'm trying to decide how to proceed with this one because this is my favorite and I get very choked up. Tom went through a series of losses. His adulthood was filled with human losses, and it began with a first wife and a first child that she died in childbirth, and both of them didn't make it. And that was really heartbreaking, and that happened around Christmas, and he had only been married a year or two. So there was some grief there. He would marry a beautiful woman who was a friend of his, and they did pretty well for a while. They moved to Los Angeles. Things were going well. They had kids. He started a family. And then, by his own brother's admission, he began to drink. And his wife at that time said, not going to have a family and do this at the same time. And so she moved back with her family to run a hotel. I believe it's in Wyoming, may have been Colorado. I think it's Wyoming, though. And Fitzgerald family can jump in and clarify which state, because I don't have it right now off the top of my head. Mama Fitzgerald kept in touch with Tom's second wife, and so did John. They sent funds. I don't know if Tom kept in touch. Tom lived a pretty private life from that point on. He was still in the town. He was actually known as a great painter, like house painter, not art painter, but painting houses. He worked for a couple of the mercantiles, but he just never could quite get back on his feet again. And by the time Mama passed away, she was the last person that lived in the Fitzgerald home. He was the caretaker of the house and kind of held onto it until it was eventually sold. And he lived in Price till the very end. And he only had 3 people attend his funeral. 2 were relatives, and 1 was a woman who happened to be driving by and saw 2 men and a grave and felt sorry for them. So she parked and got out and attended the service with him. So he had a pretty quiet end to his life. His family was still very close to him. He was very happy. He had books. He would read. According to people who knew him, he was very amiable, but there was a span of time that was just real tough for him. So that's the story of Tom N. Fitzgerald. T.D. Fitzgerald is the one that you get to love and live on forever as you imagine him. So that's what I know, and that's as much information as I can. Yeah, and I would definitely read the book because I explain it much better in the book. So if you want to go back and read it, bye, Mark. Good idea. Go until you read the book. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry if I've given spoilers to anybody. We will see you next week, and we will do Price as John knew it. Thanks again. Hope you're enjoying sheltering in. Stay healthy. Wash your hands. Talk to you later. Okay, Chris, some questions. So Papa died a bit later than the character. Yes. Yes. Yeah, he did. And Chris, I'll address Mama's boarding house in a couple weeks and explain where I think it all came together. So thank you everybody for attending. I'm having fun doing this. Hope you guys are enjoying it. We'll post it on the page. You can still ask more questions. You can private message me if I didn't answer things. And we will see you next week as we walk down the dusty streets of Early Price. Thanks.